Hi, Misha here, and well, we made it through the MiG-21, the MiG-23, the MiG-25, and of course now we get to come to the MiG-29, really the last major design from that company, that design bureau, at least to date. And have 4 1/72 scale die-cast models here. 3 from Hobby Master, and then the older one from JC. Over here we have the original 29A. Up here we have the 29UB, the 2-seater trainer. And then we have the updated, at least to some extent, 29S. Also exported as the 29C in an alternative version. And then finally we have the modern MiG-29 SMT. So with that, we'll just talk about this fighter's role in history and the potential future of the Bureau. So here we have a MiG-29A, also known as Product 912, or the FULCRUM A. This is as flown by the East German Air Force, who operated these really throughout the end of its time and into the early days of reunification. But backing up, we get to the 1960s, and Vietnam taught a lot of lessons to the USA and USSR, and air combat was changing. And it's kind of funny, the MiG-25 spurred America to develop the F-15, which the Soviets knew the program was underway. And so in 1969, that spurred them to try to come up with a fighter to counter the F-15, which again was countering their latest fighter. And they pretty much wanted it all. They wanted short takeoff and landing from rough airfields. They wanted the ability to have beyond visual range missiles. They wanted agility for the first time, let's say. They really didn't care too much about agility with the MiG-23, and they sure didn't care on the MiG-25. Now they wanted agility. They also wanted Mach 2 or greater. They wanted it to be able to use new advanced missiles and carry more than the MiG-23. They wanted good endurance. They essentially wanted everything. Oh, and it probably needs to be lightweight, easy to maintain, all that good stuff too, and cost about 2 rubles. Well, the two firms, design companies, that really were looking at this were Sukhoi and McCoy. And it was MiG that convinced them in 1970 this just was not possible. And so they split this up into essentially a heavy long-range fighter and a lightweight tactical fighter. And both Sukhoi and MiG did work on proposals, but it was soon split between them. Sukhoi got the heavy long-range fighter, which would become the Su-27, and MiG got the light tactical fighter, which became the MiG-29 here. They really got to work on the design in 1974, working on a prototype, and the first one would fly in October of 1977. And they would build 4 more prototypes, plus 9 pre-production models, flying them and testing them throughout the early 80s and into 1982. And then finally it was ready for VVS service, and it would start to equip squadrons in 1983. So with that, what do we have here? The MiG-29 was designed to be a tactical battlefield air superiority fighter, dogfighter, short range, lightweight, nimble. It's about 57 feet long with about a 37-foot wingspan. We have 2 RD-33 engines, It has a maximum speed near sea level at about Mach 1.2 and a maximum speed at altitude of about Mach 2.2 and a maximum altitude of about 59,000 feet. In armament, well, we had one 30mm cannon with 150 rounds, but its primary armament were air-to-air missiles. It carried a total of 6, 3 under each wing, and the inner hardpoint pylons were for medium-range missiles. They were going to fire the new R-27R, and then the outer hardpoints could fire the older R-60s, like the MiG-23, but really they were working on and would soon introduce the R-73. So we have new guided missiles, again both heat-seeking and radar guided. And then we have a centerline hardpoint for an external fuel tank. We do have radar. In fact, the radar in the early MiG-29 was an updated version of that of the MiG-23, the Sapphire. And likewise, the cockpit, while somewhat modernized, very much harkened back to the MiG-23 and even MiG-25. In fact, the cockpit was one of the 29's failings. Wasn't that advanced. It was agile, and the two engines gave it good redundancy. And it had a very good ejection seat, a true 0-0 ejection seat. It was quite dependable, and it could operate from short airfields, and it was designed to resist intaking dust and grit and sand. And early on in production, they would add chaff and flare dispensers. They'd be actually in these bulges here. That was based on lessons Russia was learning in Afghanistan with the MiG-23 at the time. In fact, if you look at the 23 MLD, you'll see similar dispensers there. And of course, this was not only made for the VVS, but it was made for export. The 29A was for Warsaw Pact member nations and was essentially the same aircraft, except it could not carry a nuclear weapon, and it had a slightly different avionics suite. The 29B, exported to nations like India, had a few further downgrades, including to the radar and weapons capabilities, and these were all known collectively to NATO as FULCRUM A. NATO, the USA, knew about this aircraft from the beginning. Satellites detected it while it was still very much being tested, but they didn't get an official up-close look until 1986 in Finland. But then the Soviet Union would start showing off its new fighter, and the West was quite impressed, at least somewhere. It was considered to be agile, dependable, in some ways equal to, say, an F-16, certainly better than older fighters. But they recognized, especially with the A models, it had very limited range, somewhat limited fuel, but with two engines, yeah, it was definitely a short endurance aircraft, not unlike the original MiG-21s, frankly. They also had an issue. If you did want to carry a fuel tank on the center line, you couldn't use the cannon because the ejection port for the cannon would be covered up by the fuel tank. But it had less troubles in its development than the MiG-23, that's for sure, and was a true fourth-generation fighter. And Russia would make a number of variants as well. For example, the MiG-29 UB two-seat trainer, and this is the JC wings. I am taking it off the stand because I don't trust it not to fall over if I try to rotate it. And the JC wings maybe do have a few things over the Hobbymaster, for example the air brakes deploy, but I don't know, they seem to be a little more delicate, even though the metal content's quite high. Here you can see the centerline fuel tank on this one. You can also see the missiles here. This has, did I put these on wrong? Nope. Okay, it has kind of a mix. Just noticing. This has the older R60 missile here, which, yes, these could carry. And for export, it was more frequent than with the R73, which would be more common in Russian service, at least past the first couple of years. Here we have the R73. So the trainer, the two-seater, Russia knew that it would need that for the new generation of fighters, so they just added a second cabin here. They removed the radar with the UB. They also never installed the chaff and flare dispensers up here. It did have the 30mm cannon still, and it could fire heat-seeking missiles, but not radar-guided. But that was mostly for training. Russia did nominally say that the UB could be for ground attack, but in reality, that was kind of a bluff to make them seem more important than the air forces. It was just really for training, maybe observation, what have you. But the UB would be produced in large numbers. This model here is from Poland. Poland flew the MiG-29 starting in the very late 80s. It would get a handful before the disillusionment of the Soviet Union, and they would actually buy 22 surplus ones from Germany in the early 2000s, and for a long time it was their only fighter interceptor. And really, Poland has been the biggest user of the FULCRUM in NATO for the last 2 decades. And again, JC Wings doesn't do a bad job, but I think everyone pretty much agrees that Hobbymaster has done this aircraft better. But Hobbymaster does not do a two-seater, so I thought we would bring this out here. And this was known as the FULCRUM B. With that, let's talk about upgrades. This is the MiG-29S, also known as Product 913. This was really the first upgrade, the second generation of the fighter. When the light tactical fighter was proposed, air superiority, battlefield superiority was kind of the main thing, but they were hoping it would have a secondary role for strike ground attack, much like the MiG-23. Again, with lessons from Afghanistan, they realized how important this was. Now, the original FULCRUM A's could carry dumb bombs, just iron bombs, and they could carry unguided rockets. But they had very limited range because of the fuel situation, so unless you're right up close, you're not going to be going far to do it. So they started working around 1984 on an improved variant, which the prototype first flew in 1986, and it would soon enter into service. Originally known as the 29S, about 200 were made specifically for the VVS, and it was just kind of an incremental improvement. For example, they went to a larger spine back here for additional fuel tankage, also new avionics, and it introduced a jamming system, electronic countermeasures, for the first time. It also expanded its ordnance carrying capabilities, and increased its ability to lift up to about 4,000 kilograms. So they were doing things. They would also correct the cannon issue, so you could fire it with the tank on, although eventually the ammunition capacity would be reduced to 100 shells. Now, interestingly, the hump and everything would appear on late production MiG-29s, but then that would transition over to the MiG-29S, so it was kind of a bit of a gradual thing. Regardless, NATO classified these as the FULCRUM C, and later an export model known as the MiG-29C would be offered. It would have downgraded avionics and radar, specifically the jamming system, the electronic countermeasure system would be severely restricted because that was technology Russia was pretty protective of. But on the other hand, the 29C did have expanded weapons carriage capabilities. And ultimately, this would lead to the 29SM, which was the first version kind of built trying to make this more into a multi-role aircraft or expand its ground attack capabilities. With the 29SM, for the first time, we had guided air-to-surface munitions, TV-guided, radio-guided bombs, and eventually guided anti-shipping bombs, or missiles, I should say, although these came much later. And there are plenty of other small incremental changes, including to the cockpit and what have you. And this was actually the first Hobbymaster to get released in the series, and as far as I know, it's the only product 913 that they've done so far. Most of the other ones have been the A model, the 912. So that's kind of interesting in and of itself. And this one just comes with the standard armament of 4 of the R-73s and 2 R-27s. Eventually the 27R would be replaced by an upgraded 27E medium-range missile as well. So yeah, in the late 80s they continued to improve these and show them off at different shows, but of course the Soviet Union would fall. When that happened, estimates are that about 620 A models had been built, and about 530 S or C or SM models had been built, and just under 200 UB models had been built. So you're looking at around 1,350 MiG-29s by 1991. And unfortunately, this is kind of when dark days begin for Russia and the VVS and the MiG factory and bureau in general. And this is really when things turn around for Sukhoi, who starts to get some pretty good success under Yeltsin. So with that, let's talk about our final one, the MiG-29 SMT. The MiG-29 SMT, product 917. This is the most modern, current, up-to-date version, at least to go into full production and to be used by the Russian Air Force, and it has seen combat. And even though it's actually quite a new entry into their arsenal, its roots date back really to the late 1980s and very early 1990s. After the MiG-29S, MiG-29Cs, the MiG Bureau was working on the MiG-29M, a modernized, upgraded version that would have had a lot of things, including newer engines, modern cockpit, true multi-role capability, all kinds of fancy stuff. It doesn't really matter because it didn't go anywhere. Of course, the Soviet Union would end, and that would leave MiG under hard times. And the Yeltsin administration really seemed to like giving contracts to Sukhoi. And you can't blame them. The Su-27 was more of a long-range aircraft with a larger payload, and it really wasn't that much more expensive than a MiG-29. MiG-29 was a very specific type built for the Cold War, and times were a-changing. And at this time, the Sukhoi seemed to have more multi-role capability than the current MiG-29s. MiG would keep trying, but have little success. They even tried a navalized version, the MiG-29K, to operate from Russian carriers. But finally, in November of 1997, the prototype here would first fly, but it wasn't a full-featured prototype yet. No, that would be in July of 1998 when finally the full-featured prototype of the 29 SMT would take to the skies. And MiG would offer either brand new construction versions, or it would upgrade older 29As, 29Ss for either domestic or foreign customers to the new standard. So with that, what do we have here? As the name kind of implies, this is a true multi-role version. It was based on the 29S, 29SM, and took a lot of the technology from the 29M program that was aborted. It had expanded air-to-air missile compatibility. It had air-to-surface missile and guided bomb compatibility. Heck, it could even fire some ordnance from the West. It wasn't just limited to Soviet weapons. The fuel tanks were standard, at least for the inner pylons. Although, since there's only 6 hard points, you had to be kind of careful. If you wanted to carry more, you had to sacrifice. But here we have it in kind of a strike configuration with 2 air-to-surface ordnance, and then we have 2 air-to-air for defense, plus it has 100 rounds in the cannon, and we have 2 fuel tanks for extended range. And if it wasn't on the stand, it could have the 3rd tank under the belly. And if you look on top, you'll see that not only does it have a larger spine or hump, now it's really what they call swollen. It's very fat. This is for added fuel, newer avionics, and updated radar system. We still have the chaff and flare dispensers. We now have an updated cockpit with LCD displays, more modern controls. Still not the perfect cockpit, but a lot better interface than with the original. And in the back, we have a new generation of engine. It's the RD-43, more thrust. This can now carry up to 4,500 kilograms in ordnance. Very good for air-to-surface bombs or just carrying additional fuel. And we have more range and endurance. In fact, comparing the 29A to the 29 SMT, it has 30% more fuel internally, and thanks to updates to the airframe, it has 150% of the range. So it can go further on the same amount of fuel. Lots of other navigation updates. It has GPS tracking, coordination, better data link systems, the usual stuff. And so MiG started marketing this in the early 21st century, and the Russian Air Force was interested, but really 98 through the early 2000s, Russia was in a major depression, so money was tight. But thankfully, things did loosen up around 2004, 2005, when Russia started exporting more energy, oil and gas, to its neighbors, and so finally the VVS was able to afford to upgrade some of its aging 29A and 29S fleet to the 29 SMT. And there's a bunch there. If, for example, older planes were grounded in 2008 when problems were found. To be fair, these birds were 20 plus years old. Some of them approaching 25 years old. Luckily, in 2009, a foreign customer backed out of a deal to purchase 28 SMTs, and these would end up with the VVS in 2010. So these would be their first new production models. And they would continue to upgrade some older ones, extending the service life of their airframes. They would strengthen them for launching air-to-surface ordnance, carrying more bombs and whatnot. They did consider just retiring the 29, but instead in 2014 they purchased 16 more SMTs, which were delivered towards the end of 2015. And there are plans to have at least 100 in service. And they would soon introduce these to combat. They would go in 2017 to Syria, and they would be used for two main roles: bomber, escort, for example, the Su-34, escorting those, thanks to their longer range, and strike, or ground attack, thanks to their expanded multi-role capability. And much like with the FA-18, one fighter could potentially do both roles. In fact, that's this aircraft here, this model from Hobbymaster. This is kind of a special model from them, but it's in the same general series, but they actually give it a unique product number. And it has more changes than the rest. It comes with actually quite a bit of ordnance. This one is from one that did serve in Syria in 2017. And then was at a meetup in 2019 for Russian technology. Before anyone says anything, yes, I know the MiG-29 was first introduced in 2007, but that hasn't really taken off to any great extent. In fact, MiG is frankly lucky to have the SMT contracts, because Sukhoi is still kind of dominating with the updated versions of the 27, the 30 interceptors, the 33s, which serve the Navy, the 34s, and the 35s, and now the newest Su-57, the Felon. So while the 1950s and 60s and even 70s seem to belong to MiG in Russia, the 90s, 2000s, and 2020s seem to be the time for Sukhoi. And, well, they both make interesting aircraft, but they do have different design concepts, really. But yeah, this one is pretty neat. Like the big guided missile here, tanks. These stands are metal stemmed, and they slot in. Really good stands on these. They did a good job. To date, MiG has produced just over 1,600 29s, but as I said, about 1,350 were built before the fall of the Soviet Union. So only a couple of hundred have been built since then. However, they've had contracts to refurbish, update, upgrade, retrofit older models. So that's keeping them going to some extent. So what do you think about the Fulcrum? When I first became interested in 172 scale diecast and then started getting into Russian MiGs, I wanted a MiG-29. This was the cool enemy aircraft when I was a kid. And Hobbymaster wasn't doing them yet. And there wasn't even... Yes, and I know my fuel tank just fell off. They weren't even on the horizon yet. So that's why I ended up with the JC wings. Whitty had done some before. Gemini might have. They're kind of all in the same tooling. But the JCs, they just don't have the feel and the paint, the sturdiness of the Hobbymasters. So that's why when Hobbymaster came out with theirs, I had to pick them up. And they're doing some neat models like the SMT that I don't believe others have done. They've done about a dozen now, but most are just repaints of the 29A. One interesting one is actually from the Iranian Air Force, though. But yeah, just wanted to show you these and kind of complete the MiG family, well, with the exception of the MiG-19, which still kind of irks me for no one doing those, but what can you do? And it would have been nice to have a MiG-27 from Hobbymaster, but not a requirement. They're doing a really good job of giving us a bunch of Sukhois, and with that, since we've been talking about the 29, which was kind of the last success for MiG, now let's talk about the Su-27 next time, which, if not the first success for Sukhoi, was kind of what made him an international superstar, if that makes sense. But that's for next time. I think this video is plenty long enough, don't you? I appreciate you hanging out with me. Let me know what you think of these models. With that, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time with some flankers.